welcome to Attic Raiders Retro Reviews, where today we're going to be entering into a world of magic as we begin the process of painting up the playing pieces for the classic game, HeroQuest. Today we're going to be starting with one of my favourites, the Chaos Warriors, and for this I'm going to be going for a really classic traditional paint scheme. In fact, I'm going to be basing it on the box artwork. I'm going to do two of the Chaos Warriors in this very dark iron colour scheme, and I'm going to do other two which are going to be very slightly different, and I'm just going to add more oranges and browns to them in order to make them a lot more rusty, but I'm still going to go with this kind of dark iron colour scheme. This to me is my favourite. There's lots of different colour schemes you can do with this, and I've seen some cracking paint jobs, but I really like this traditional medieval dark shiny armour colour. So that's what we're going to be going for today. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to start with a base coat of polished steel here. Now this is a Metalcote from Humbrol, and I'm not actually going to use all Citadel colours. I'm going to use a bit of a mishmash, lots of different types of paints, whatever I have at hand. This is my secret weapon. I really love this dark Metalcote colour. Now the good thing with the Humbrol paints, the Metalcote ones, is that you can actually buff them, because the metal pigments in them, when you wipe it with a cloth, actually shine up and give this really lovely real shine. So you just need to use a bit of elbow grease and get scrubbing on them, and it gives this really lovely result. That's a really nice dark base, but we want it to be a bit lighter, so I'm going to take some polished aluminium and I'm going to wipe off most of the paint onto a piece of paper and do a bit of dry brushing. I'm just going over this, highlighting all of the raised sections with that polished aluminium, which gives it this really nice, very simple edge highlighting. It's a really easy way of doing this rather than going over every individual edge with a really thin paintbrush. This just picks out all of the edges and it gives that really nice shine to it. I'm wanting this armour to look old. I don't want it to look brand new. So what I've done is I've gone in and given it another pass of dry brushing. I dry brushed it with some bronze paint, and then once that was dry, I dry brushed it with some brass paint, and that just adds some different textures or tones in there and varies it up a bit so that we don't just have that kind of steel silver kind of look. By adding in those brown tones, it makes it more interesting. Now I could leave it like that, but for me, when I've dry brushed that on, it's gone a little bit too into the brown. So what I'm doing is using a very light dry brush of that polished steel again over the top of that, and that just knocks some of that colour down. It kind of breaks up the kind of brown tones a little bit more to make them far more subtle, and it gets more of that base coat back in to tie everything back together. You can see there's still hints of those colours in there, but it's much more muted, it's much more natural, and that's the way I like it. It's time to start working on some of the detail now, so I'm going to go for leather boots and gauntlets. So to do that, I'm starting with this really dark leather brown from Revell here, and using the paintbrush just to carefully pick those out. Then once that's dry, using a lighter brown, this time from Humbrol, and going over the boots and the gauntlets, dry brushing them, just picking out those details, making sure that you dry brush against the grain, so going across the detail of the fingers there in order to pick out the raised highlights. I'm going to go for the horns on the Chaos Warrior, and for these I'm using a base coat of Wraithbone from Citadel. This is a really nice colour for bone and horn because it's not too much of a stark white. I don't like to use white as a base coat whenever possible. Try to use something that's not quite such a sharp colour. With that done, it's then time to take some black from Revell and just using a very, very fine brush to paint in the visor on this warrior's helmet. Don't actually need to do this at this stage, but I really like to do detail as we go along. Next up is the axe, and I want this to be traditional, so it's just going to be wooden with kind of rope binding with a metal head on it. So for this I'm using another brown. This one, again, I want to get a contrast between the brown of the gauntlet and the brown of the shaft that he's holding. So I'm using deliberately a different kind of brown. This one is a dark earth, so that you've got that dark and light contrast. I'm then going to do the bindings, the wrapping of the handle for the axe. And for this, I want it to be a kind of rope colour, but I don't want it to be too white, too stark, and I also don't want it to be too brown. I don't want it to blend into the shaft or a lot of the other browns around about. So I'm going for a beige colour, which is kind of a midway between the brown and the white. And I'm just being very careful, watering down that paint a little bit to get a nice consistency and flow to it, and using a sharp brush in order to paint that in. I've now jumped ahead a little bit, and I've already applied a beige colour to the bottom half of these horns here. You can see they're a much more browny kind of colour. With that done, I'm now applying an actual white. I know I said I don't really like white, but because I'm doing it as a dry brush, it's very, very light. And I'm just applying that to the top half of the horns, and then working that, kind of stippling a little bit that dry brush over the top of some of that beige, and just working it in so that that white blends into the beige, so we get a nice gradation from the white into the beige, light to dark, and that makes it look more natural. Now I want even more of a blend on these horns, so I'm applying a little bit of a leather brown around the very base of the horns where they meet the helmet, and then just using a thinner in order to blend that out and feather it down across the rest of the horn. In my personal experience, I find that Citadel washes are great, but you don't get an awful lot of control over them, whereas enamel paints from Humbrol, with a bit of thinner, white spirits in this case, gives you a lot more control. And I'm just going to take a bit more of that leather, thin it down, and use that as a wash on the binding here in order to get down into those crevices. I don't want this armour to all be one single colour though, so I'm going to take a little bit of brass scorpion on a very fine brush and use that to pick out some of the details. Not a lot, just a few, enough to give it a bit more visual interest. So I'm picking out all of the rivets on his armour and the little skull symbol on his shoulder armour here, or rondel, which I think is a really nice little piece of detail, so I'm going to pick that out and highlight it. Now I have seen people painting both of the rondels, doing a yin-yang symbol on the other one, which looks really nice depending on your paint scheme, but I'm going for very traditional, and for me I don't feel that that would go well with what I'm doing here. A little bit of beige dry brushing on the handle wrap here, just to highlight those raised edges and give a little bit more whiteness to that, a little bit more rope colour, and also to highlight that detail a little bit more and to bring out the depth on that wrapping. Speaking of depth, it's now time to go in and add some real darkness into those shadowed recessed areas. Now for armour, most people would use Nuln oil from Citadel, but I'm actually going for Agrax Earthshade for this, and just applying that as a light wash and making sure that that runs into all of those recessed areas, particularly the deep crevices, but making sure that it doesn't pool. I find that when you do an overall wash on a piece, that it will bind all the colours together, but it will also mute them down and dull them. So I'm using the polished steel again that we used for our base colour, and dry brushing over all of the raised areas, the highlights, just in order to add a bit more life and a bit more vibrancy, and to add back in some of that colour that that wash muted down. And that polished steel does dry to a dull colour, so it's time once again to buff it up. Again, just using a soft disposable cloth here and rubbing it over all of the highlighted areas in order to shine those up and give it that lovely sheen. And I'm still not quite happy with the wrapping on the handle. Find that it doesn't quite stand out enough from the other colours there, so I'm going over it with another pass of dry brushing, using Wraithbone to highlight those raised areas, give it a bit more of a white tone, and to just get more of a contrast between high and the low points. Finally, time for the base, and I'm using polished steel for the bases of all of my HeroQuest miniatures. You can paint it on very carefully while it's watery and wet, but as it dries it starts to go clumpy, so at that point you can stipple it on and add some nice texture to the base. And finally, you've guessed it, even more buffing, using a soft cloth and wiping those highlights in order to get that metal coat to shine nicely. The base can be a little bit of a problem, particularly between the legs, in order to be able to buff that well enough, but I find that if you kind of wrap the cloth around the end of a paintbrush and then use that to wipe back and forth, you can buff it up nicely, and it does give this really nice sheen. As I said, that slightly clumpy texture gives it just something that I really like, this texture on the base and the shine to it that works really well for me. And it's time to add this Chaos Warrior to the rest of his troop. You can see that the two on the left here I've painted using the same colours and techniques and ordering that I've just gone over in this video. The two on the right are very similar, but they are slightly different from the scheme that I've just shown you. Basically what I did was I painted them up the way I've just shown in this video, but near the end I gave them a thinned down wash of an orangey brown, which I kind of stippled on and then dry brushed some more of that orange brown on top, just to make them look far more rusty. So I hope you found that useful. If you'd like to tell us how you get on with painting, please leave a message in the comments below. Or if you've got any of your own tips or tricks that you'd like to share, please get in touch. Please remember to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed what you've seen here, and there's going to be plenty more of this coming up. Until next time though, this is Agrax Retro Reviews.